Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's open source panel. I'm super excited to be here today with you all and also with our three panelist guests today, talking about open source software and how it's helping organizations deliver better software today. Open source software is aligning industries and helping us solve for solutions, major challenges that we have today. So it's going to be an amazing conversation and love to get there. But before we get started, I'd just like to remind everyone to feel free to use the chat for any questions that you may have for our panelists or for our panel today. We'd love to get to all of that. And also, I'll be your moderator. My name is Tiffany Jachja. I'm a technical evangelist at Harness. I've been following a couple of open source projects as a contributor and as a user for quite some time now. And I'm super excited for our panelists today to introduce themselves and talk about the different open source communities that they've been a part of and what they're working on today. So we can actually go around the room and start alphabetically with you, Jeremy.
So I'm Jeremy Davis. I'm a chief architect for app dev solutions at Red Hat. I've been at Red Hat for 10 years now, just hit my 10-year anniversary. Before then, I did a lot of different code, and most of my career has been involved with open source. I started out during the .com boom as a web monkey, and did a lot of Perl in those days, but used pretty much started my career with open source software because that was the easiest way to learn, right? I could just download stuff and get going. So MySQL meant that I could learn how to use a database, right? Without having to, buy lots of licenses. So I've used a ton of different open source projects. I used a lot of the JBoss stuff that, of course, JBoss was acquired by Red Hat, right? And it made it pretty easy to slot into Red Hat and help customers build solutions with what used to be called JBoss software. Recently, I've spent a lot of time with Quarkus, which is Red Hat's new Java runtime. A really exciting project. And then I'm working on currently like some of the demo, a lot of the demo work and stuff that I do is all done as open source. It's projects that are on GitHub. Everything's totally out in the open, right? That's kind of Red Hat's culture. And I can tell you a little anecdote though, when the open source light bulb kind of went off for me was a long time ago. I was working, our CEO of the company I was working at the time told us to came into the dev floor and said get us off of Oracle right now. I don't know what precipitated that, but we had to get off of Oracle really quickly, and so we're moving off of their app server. And we grabbed JBoss because I'm in Atlanta. There was a local company, and we noticed some things weren't behaving the way we expected. And so I downloaded the source code to the JBoss app server. I set some breakpoints. I watched this stuff debug, and I was able to figure out what was going on, right, without opening a support ticket, without talking to anybody. And at that point, I thought, okay, this open source thing is this is for me. So that's been the past almost 20 years.
Awesome. So I love that. I love that story, and it really talks about some of the challenges that people kind of face on their day-to-day jobs. I'd love to move on to you, JJ. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm JJ. My hand's moving. I don't have a green screen. I'm sorry. Yes, I'm a developer advocate for the IBM Cloud. I've been in the open source world since I honestly can remember. I started my whole open source world, I guess, is a good word for it, back on FreeBSD 2.2.2, believe it or not. My high school at the time was trying to change out some servers, and no joke, my Eagle Scout project was to build out that network, which was kind of cool. Then fast forward a few years, tried to do some non-open source stuff, but it was a siren song. I came back to it, and I really did cut my teeth in the OpenStack world. I was really big into there. And then I was part of Chef Software for a long time, where I got to actually see the business side of open source and how open source can be successful. And now I'm at IBM trying to make people use the IBM cloud in the best way possible.
Awesome. Tracy?
Well, I am Tracy Ragan. I am the CEO of DeployHub. I am also a board member of the CD Foundation and the executive director of an open source project called Ortelius. My first entry into open source, I got a call from a friend who said, hey, IBM is starting this new foundation called the Eclipse Foundation. I think you should really consider joining it. And I said, okay. And he said, here, call this person. His name was Skip McGorry. And so I gave Skip McGorry a call. And Skip said, yes, please, please join. We're trying to build this foundation. It would be great to have a woman on the board. So I was one of the founding members of the Eclipse Foundation. And that I went through about a 5-year odyssey of being the only woman on the board, which was kind of interesting. And I was skeptical, to be honest. I was super skeptical of this open source kind of world. And at the time, we actually initially did a study with Harvard about open source and how companies would embrace it and how it would be monetized in the future. And everything that they predicted has come true. And I have found it really, really fascinating. When Tracy Miranda at CloudBees reached out to me and talked to me about the CD Foundation, and when she said, we're thinking about creating a kind of a sub chapter of the Linux Foundation for the CD Foundation, and we're going to potentially move Jenkins into that, and we're working with Google and Netflix as well. I was all about it because I felt like this is the correct time for having a discussion around continuous delivery with the kind of the tsunami that we're seeing in terms of the shift into microservices and Kubernetes. It's kind of an important topic. So that's kind of been my journey. I've always been at a governing board level. Ortelius is my first project where I'm actually doing work and committing. So now I have had both sides at the governing board, and now I'm having fun working on a project. And I have to say that open source in terms of building community and the heart behind it is pretty amazing.
That's so awesome. I love to hear that story. And it always speaks to like, to like people's experiences, like how it's different, how people come into open source, right? Because no matter who you are, like you eventually get into like, oh, what is this open source thing? And then you kind of experience like this kind of light bulb moment where it becomes real to you, and then it ends up being a part of your day-to-day work almost. And so it's really incredible to hear from our panelists and hear that story. I'd love to again go around the room and talk about what are some of the major challenges that you're seeing with people delivering software today, whether it's with the cloud, with microservices, and what are the open source communities, spaces, and maybe interest groups that are emerging or that are here for organizations to help kind of be a part of for solving those challenges. Why don't we start with you, JJ?
Sure. So I'm gonna maybe just pivot the question a little bit by answering it this way. For me, open source and building the community around a project is paramount, right? Like it is. You cannot have open source without some level of community based around it, where people are doing honestly free work, right? When you look at what open source is, you are putting yourself to your code or your community management or your doc write or whatever, however you're putting yourself into the project, you are doing work to help gain something for the betterment of someone else. It scratches an itch, right? So for me, the ability to build a strong community, the ability to have the correct level of governance around it is paramount. I also want to mention that in these moments that we are like, where are we? We're on a Zoom call, right? We can't actually be in the same room together to have this conference. I'd like to mention that open source is a beacon of the best part of humanity right now, where if you actually look at open source and what people can give to themselves to a project, whether big or small, shows that open source is actually the best of humanity right now. We're coming together. We all have itches. We need to be scratched. And we find in different ways, in different shapes and forms, to be able to commit to that. Get it? Commit? No? Come on. There we go. And we can make things happen, right? So I guess I didn't really answer your question, but I really did want to get that out there, especially with this audience. I feel like that would resonate very well.
Yeah, I love that. It just sounds like different organizations or individuals can kind of come together, right, and really create something that's real and that can live for other people. And I think that's really important around these times, especially when you talk about like, well, how do you scale software delivery? How do you make this open for everybody, not just like the top 1% or the Amazons of the world, right? But for everybody, like maybe even an individual contributor that just wants to be able to get their software out there for other people, I think open source plays a major role in that. And I think that also speaks to what the Continuous Delivery Foundation also does. And I don't know, Tracy, did you want to speak a little bit on that?
Well, I'm going to first to answer the question. There are some challenges that companies are facing. I mean, software is always hard. It has always been hard. Some companies have got their stuff figured out, and some companies don't. Now, with microservices and Kubernetes, we are facing all of this over again. It's kind of like that scene in Monty Python where they're searching for the Holy Grail, and they get to the French castle, and they're like, "We've got one. It's quite nice." Well, guess what? They're going to have to go find a new one because now microservices is disrupting it. And it speaks to the challenge of companies today getting to DevOps at scale. And it speaks to the name of this conference, Unscripted. We have to stop with static processes. With a Kubernetes microservices environment, you are really building a dynamic application with lots of moving parts. And having a lot of scripted pieces kind of duct taped into a CD pipeline has to change. That is one of the big challenges. The CD Foundation as an open source community is working to address that. And I want to speak to something about being passionate. I'm sort of a serial volunteer, to be honest. I live in a small community in New Mexico that has a historic ballpark that when we moved here, it was literally falling apart. They had some money from the county. They hadn't really gotten it pulled together. So I joined that committee and we rebuilt this amazing historic ballpark. I don't care about baseball, but I really love history and I found it really, really important to save that. We're sort of facing that right now in the open source community with this shift to microservices. If you become passionate about the problem, and I don't want to call microservices a problem, but they are a disruptor. If you become passionate about that, you begin understanding that we as a community have an opportunity to simplify things for many, many, literally hundreds of developers. If we can do that in the open source community, we are giving back to the industry that has given me an amazing life. So I almost feel I have a passion about it, right? It's about that ballpark. It's a beautiful ballpark. I want to save it. This is a problem set that we can work on together and build that community that JJ talked about being, it's a lifesaver for a lot of people because it's access to other people that we get to talk about. We get to talk to our peeps who are passionate about the same things that we are passionate about. So it's fun. I mean, open source is actually a lot of fun. We are doing something for free, but we're solving a core problem. And that's the essence of open source.
Yeah, I love that. Jeremy, did you want to add anything about the current communities and spaces that exist for organizations today?
Yeah, and to follow up too on what Tracy was saying, I think that's a really good point. In open source, somebody does a joked once about open source was people solving, hackers solving problems for each other, which to a great extent is true, right? I mean, open source never really came up with the kind of really nice user interfaces, that Apple came up with, right? Or Microsoft does with their desktop, right? If you ever used, Linux desktops, right? Which I have used tons of Linux desktops, right? But that part that the proprietary piece, still exists, right? And in terms of the corporate world, the way that you do business is always going to be proprietary, right? The way that I, determine how to make loans or how to, service my customers is proprietary stuff. But the infrastructure piece where companies don't compete, it has been moving towards open source now for a long time. And I think a lot of what we see in terms of like CI/CD and microservices and dealing with these problems is addressed in that way. And a lot of the trends we see, like infrastructure as a code, right? These things used to be silos inside of an organization, and we're moving away from taking this to be a siloed team that owns this domain and being something that's publicly accessible that anybody can see, right? And we then gain efficiencies on top of that, right? As Tracy was mentioning, we can't just have all these scripted deployments, right? Like I'm old enough that I remember building with Ant, right? And Ant was a disaster, right? It was you could never figure out your Ant build, right? And we sort of moved to a more standard ways of doing that by solving that in the open source community, because hackers get together and we figure out this is actually the best way to build things. Figure out a couple ways, right? Because somebody's always got a different idea. But when everybody has eyes on something, those technical problems tend to be solved a lot better. So I think we're seeing this move into the corporate world or the enterprise in a couple of different ways. I think part of that is things like infrastructure as a code and DevOps, where we sort of, flatten things and make them accessible to everybody inside the organization. I also think in terms of something that JJ was mentioning, as we're all distributed now, so Red Hat's always been an open source company. When our development managers get headcount, the first thing they do is they look to see who's contributing inside the community, right? So they just go to GitHub and look at who is sending some pull requests. And if that person, if we're located in Raleigh as our headquarters and then outside of Boston, but if the person who's making the most pull requests lives in Brazil, then that person gets a job offer, right? Or if they live in France, they get a job offer. And so we've always been a very distributed worldwide company. And I think open source kind of dictates that because anybody can make a commit. And as we're now all dealing with the notion of being locked down and not going into offices, that kind of approach to finding talent and engaging your workers is also starting to hit, as a requirement, right? But it's something that the open source communities have lived with forever, or since, day one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love hearing that because it just sounds like different, even organizations are kind of investing into different software solutions and open source communities, and even in some cases creating their own open source strategy so that they can open source their products and really and give that out to the community, right? So I'd love to hear from all of you. How do you spend your time as a contributor, and how does that role kind of play into the health of open source community and to the lifeblood of that project? Why don't we start with Tracy?
Well, let's just go to my most recent. Right now, the CD Foundation, I have spent quite a bit of time with the CD Foundation getting it off the ground. I was one of the first, and I'm on the board because I'm the board member rep, so I kind of take that pretty serious. I know that we have members out there who want things from us. So I have worked very hard to build the infrastructure of the CD Foundation in terms of outreach, getting, helping Jackie with pulling together when she started, Jackie Salinas, our ecosystem director. She started about, I think we were close to maybe 8 months into the CD Foundation, and she didn't have a whole lot of, she had to build out this outreach program that she was working on. Watching her go through I was the first to do a webinar and the first to do a podcast just so we could test out the process, working on getting CDCon together, working just in general on the outreach efforts. Almost like if you think about it, you take any company, you have to have somebody's doing marketing. I took on that marketing role, and I had a lot of fun with it. I've met everybody. I've met like you, Tiffany. It's been great. But in the Ortelius project, I'm taking more of an executive director role, and I'm doing a lot of recruiting. I spend a lot of time on LinkedIn looking for folks that I feel might be a good fit, and I find out if they've ever contributed to an open source, and if they haven't, I really encourage them, because those are the folks we want to reach out to. We're working with quite a few women. I have a very specific goal for the Ortelius project to bring more women into open source, and they don't necessarily participate that much in open source. So it's exciting to see more women coming in, because open source offers more than just free code to the commercial community. It is a platform for education. And I'm working with, we have one woman who came from the QA side. She wants to go into project management, so she's a co-community manager. I have another person who is a project manager, and she wants to start programming, so she's learning to do pull requests and write Python. I think that when you're looking at how you can contribute to open source, you have to realize you can put on just about any hat you want. And try new things. And that's what I've done with the CD Foundation, and it's been great.
That's so amazing. JJ, I saw you nod your head at, open source as being a way for enablement and for empowering other people to make a shift into whatever it is that they're most passionate about. Do you want to add to some of the, to the conversation about like, where do you spend your time as a contributor and how does that role play into the health of a community?
First of all, she's absolutely right. Open source is a great educational tool. It can empower, if you have the passion, I like to call it the hunger, right? The hunger, because it is self-starting, right? Like You're not going to have someone come to you and be like, here, do this. You need to find it in yourself. But when you do, there's a whole community of people out there that are willing to help you move forward, learning those things. You just need to take that first step. I want to go ahead and tell a little hack that I have and how I get started in open source communities, because I touch so many different ones because that's my job, right? Is that I like writing getting started guides. I like writing the day one experience that I have with some project. That is how I, first of all, learn about how a project's being done. That's also how I get exposed to the people who play inside that project. And also, when I finally finish it, I can commit it back as this was my experience with this open source project. Believe it or not, that works for almost anyone. Because if you're just coming into this world and trying to find an open source project to work with, your day one experience with that project is gold to the developers. They don't realize it most of the time because they've been stuck in their own little world and they see everything with blinders on. But when rando person comes in and says, okay, I'm going to try to get this working. Oh, this was a cluster, right? Like that right there, that experience of you having that and giving that to the developers, depending on the community, it's also your mileage may vary, right? But 9 out of 10 times, developers, because they're passionate about their project, they need that feedback. It's not all rainbows and unicorns everywhere. It's actually sometimes something just doesn't work. Like, why are you change mod 777 on Etsy hosts? That seems really bad, like really bad, right? Those types of things is really great. So my hack is find getting started. Take your day one experience and upstream that.
JJ, I'm so glad you said that because, we're doing a hackathon and, we've created a page, and the first thing that I put on there, if you want to get involved, is give us a day one experience. It's important, right?
Yeah,
it's so
it really
important,
is.
and it's an easy way for people to get involved. It's like sign up, go through the sample app and write a blog, tell us what's wrong, open some tickets. Perfect way to get started.
And then it pays on itself, right? Because then all of a sudden someone else does that getting started guide, the one that you just wrote, they improve it a little bit more, and now you have 2 people who can do it. And it's usually a little bit the sharper edges are shaved down. So then all of a sudden it's a recruiting mechanism, because now all of a sudden you have a great day one experience. So let's start talking about day 2 and day N, and things just come together.
Yeah, I love that hack.
It's a great point too. Users will always use things in ways that you didn't necessarily imagine.
It's true.
Yes, they
True.
do.
Giving that feedback to teams is really helpful, and often, especially open source teams, they tend to often already know each other when they start projects, right? So getting an outside voice can be really, really valuable. Also, submitting bug requests, right, or feature enhancements. And because it's open source, you can download the source code and give a really detailed bug request. And this is actually one of the guys, Michael Tiemann, who was one of the earliest open source guys, and he's been a Red Hatter. It was a Red Hat acquisition. His company was a Red Hat acquisition a long time ago. He had some numbers around this where the real money that you save inside of open source, because it is cheaper to do open source development than proprietary development, but the real money comes from being able to identify your bugs faster. That because somebody has source code and they can point you to, line 163 in this class file is, calculating something incorrectly, or is splitting the string incorrectly. Saves so much time from having to start with, test, filing a bug request, having to start to write tests, having to, get data sets. You can actually drill down in with your own data set exactly what's happening. So submitting bug requests, especially detailed, nice bug requests like that, are hugely valuable to open source communities. And a great way to get started too, because it can be very daunting the first time you actually send like a pull request for code you wrote for somebody else to look at your code. That can be a little bit scary. But sending a nice detailed bug request, sending some documentation, contributing to a project is a really great way to get started.
Yeah, it reminds me of the story about Kubernetes when they were trying to help develop it and release it to the open source community. They actually did like a hackathon day where they had like all of their contributors, their top contributors, go and try to install Kubernetes themselves following their own documentation. And because they were trying it on their own and they didn't have, like they had to pretend like they didn't have any context of the project, right? They were just following the documentation. They learned so much about it. And I remember even Kelsey Hightower talking about that, and he was sharing that story, and like it's really cool to see like different people within the community kind of pointing out these kind of funny stories that people like, you know, you have so much context as an open source contributor that sometimes you don't realize like what it's like to be an outsider or what it's like to be a newbie on the project trying to figure out ways to contribute. So I love some of these tips. I'd love to also hear. I know that there's like a lot of right ways to do open source and a lot of ways to keep the health of the community like healthy. But what do you think are some like wrong things to do in an open source community? What are some maybe stories or things that you've seen? And I'd love to start with you, Jeremy, on that.
I'm honestly a little bit on the fence about this. I think if the problem set really needs solving, communities tend to, and if the software is good enough, communities kind of tend to work out. Because I know if you, especially, people are a little more polite now, but in the early, 10 years ago or so, if you ever spent any time on the Apache mailing list, you could tell that people weren't necessarily all that nice to each other or or nice to other people who were contributing in those communities. There's a lot of infighting, and these were from some really massively successful projects, right? So I don't know that I think if you're doing good enough work, that probably will sort itself out to the top, right? But that being said, and I think, as we've moved along and open source has matured, some people have gotten a little bit nicer, right? And not everybody's yelling each other over mailing lists. But certainly, having community managers, like a lot of companies, Red Hat, many other companies employ community managers, right? You actively cultivate that kind of community. You make sure that people are, feel like that they're valued as part of participation. Is a great way to steer something forward. Putting things inside of foundations, right? It's always important that a real open source community not be seen to be controlled by one vendor. And that's one big, you mentioned Kubernetes, right? It's a good example, right? So Google made sure that Google's still the main contributor. Red Hat's number 2 though. They made sure that there were other people involved with that. In fact, they reached out to Red Hat when they open sourced Kubernetes. But it's important to not be seen as just, it's an open source project, but one company's driving it. People tend not to really gravitate to those kind of projects as much.
That's really great advice. JJ?
Yeah. So I recently had, or not really recently, actually, it's a couple of years ago now, a conversation in the role I was at Chef, where I had a partner of ours actually be like, "Hey, JJ, I want to open source a project. How do I do that?" And I'm like, whoa. There's a few things you got to think about here. Mm-hmm. And during that conversation, I started staring out my window because honestly, he really didn't know what he was talking about at the time. But that's beside the point. But I saw there was a park outside my window, and I saw people picking up trash. And it clicked with me all of a sudden, where that was a perfect analogy to what an open source project is. Bear with me for a moment. It's a little bit of a journey, but it makes sense. So this gentleman was like, "So JJ, do I just like put the code on GitHub and spin up a wiki?" And I'm like, no. Turns out starting up an open source project is like trying to get a trash pickup working for a park. Okay. So first of all, nobody cares about the logistics. So all the stuff that you need to do to get approvals done up your company's line to make something open source, to deal with your lawyers and your IP, nobody cares. I would put a lot more colorful language in this, but I realize that is inappropriate at this juncture. What they care about is that they are there to help you beautify that park, or in this case, write some code. But there's also logistics you've got to think about. Here in Texas, where I am, you can't just go like, "Hey, let's go have a park cleanup today." You actually need logistics around it, including trash pickup areas, water, because Texas is hot and people will forget to drink, so you need water stations. You need people to be able to go around to those trash pickup areas to take the trash to a central location. There's a whole world of stuff around that. So the thing that you think about when you're looking into open sourcing a project or going down that path is those logistics. And to his point earlier, to Jeremy's point earlier, there's this world of logistics that, and to put it in a foundation, there are some already frameworks out there that can really, really be successful. So what I'm trying to get to is, don't just open source and dump something on GitHub, because that is the wrong way to do it. Also, you got to make sure that you are going to have a trickle of people come in. You're not just going to release something and all of a sudden everyone's going to start using it. You're going to have a trickle of people coming by every little bit once in a while. And if you don't have a community manager or something like that, the first negative thing that happens, you will see it drop off, because people don't want to be in negative worlds, right? So you need to be able to have a positive, engaging code of conduct. For the love of God, have a code of conduct, because you need to have a contract with your community on, this is how we're going to run this project. So long story short, think about all the logistics. Nobody cares about it, but you're going to need to do it. Have some type of code of conduct. Otherwise, you're going to have problems down the line, because you need to have that contract. And third, negativity just makes your project fail.
Yeah, I totally agree. You know, of all those kind of open source horror stories that people get, and it turns people off, and then they decide like, oh, maybe open source is not right for them, and there are a lot of stories around that too that we've heard in the past. And Tracy, do you have anything to add to the conversation around this?
I think if you're going to start an open source project, you have to look at the problem you're solving. Is it a big enough problem? It might be a problem for you, maybe a problem for, a few others, but is it big enough that it impacts everyone? If it is big enough that it impacts everyone, then you have a better chance of building a community of finding passionate people to solve that problem. So I know there's a lot of open source projects out there. Some of them don't succeed. Many of them probably don't succeed. More probably don't succeed than succeed. And I often, when I look at them, I think it wasn't a big enough problem. Enough people weren't suffering, so they couldn't. It just wasn't big enough to bring in the people to help fix it. The other thing is, I was at a DevOps World, and I tell this story because it's important for the open source community to hear it, even though it might be a bit painful. I was at DevOps World, I guess it's been a year ago, and they had a diversity lunch, and I was sitting at a table with both men and women of color. And I asked the question, how many of you have ever contributed to an open source project? One woman raised her hand, and she says, I tried. She said, I tried 3 different open source projects, but the pull request I created never even got a response. And that's really sad, right? Everybody's pull request should at least get a response. So don't let anything sit out there idle, because somebody did some hard work and thought that they were doing something useful, and they weren't even given a hey, thank you. So I think that you have to treat your community, your contributors, like you're working for a company, and every single person is important. Every single person has a voice, and every single person deserves a seat at the table. And I think that in the past we've had good old boys clubs in open source, and that has caused a lot of people not to get involved. And that's a crime. It's a shame, because everybody does have something to offer. And if we can create more diversity around open source, we actually start solving some of the larger problems that the industry have in general, like getting women into the room. Yay, there's 2 of us on this panel today. But in general, if you were to look at any conference, it's less than 10% of women who show up, and potentially less than that of people of color, especially Black and Latinos. So we need to fix that, and open source could do that.
Yeah, I love that. And it's just this idea that you have a core team, right, that really promotes a sense of belonging and alignment in your open source community. And I really love hearing that. I'd love to also hear a little bit more about tips as a contributor. Do you have any tips for being, that person submitting a pull request? What are some things that you've seen work really well for people like that want to readily contribute or readily actually help help progress a project? I'd love to start with you, JJ.
Sure. So one of the hardest things when you're trying to start off in a project is to find the location where people actually talk. Um, the collection of ideas where they're being shifted back and forth, either synchronously or asynchronously, is sometimes the hardest thing to find. And also to be willing to be just an observer for a while. There's levels of commitment to any open source project, right? Like there's the drive-by PR that you're like, I found a spelling mistake in the README, right? To I want to write the core code for this project. And also depends on the maturity of the project, right? Like to Tracy's point, a lot of projects fail. But at the same time, there's a lot of projects out there that are like small little widgets that don't really do anything apart from scratch that specific itch. So there's research you've got to do. You can't just be like, I want to be an open source developer and then have open source find you. No. You need to go out and do the proactive work. So the first thing you need to do, in my personal opinion, is find the location where the conversations happen. I'm the type of person, I have Slack literally running on another screen. That's why you can kind of see my eyes every once in a while pop over. And I have a bunch of Slack teams going on. I also use Freenode, believe it or not. I still get on Freenode because there's a lot of open source development out there. It's still on IRC. Yes, I realize there's a whole religious war around Slack, IRC, and Matrix and all that stuff. But the point being is if you want to be active in these communities, you need to find out where those conversations are happening and engage with those communities on the way they speak if you want to get more involved.
Mm-hmm. Love that. Jeremy, do you know of any open source projects that are readily looking for contributors and places where people can contribute? Love to hear about that.
So I would, there's probably there's tons, right? And so we've talked about like big picture open source projects, like we've talked about Kubernetes and we're talking, Eclipse Foundation, right? Tomcat, but there's a lot of small. One tool I've been using recently is called WireMock, right? It's just a way to use in your testing, right? In Java testing. I guess you could use it outside of Java too, but to sort of to fake things that are going across the wire. It's an open source project. It's run mostly by one guy. He's super responsive. But one person only has so much time, right? And I would say like if you have a problem, somebody else has that problem as well, right? And as developers, it's often very easy to say, hey, you know what? I'm just going to roll my own, testing framework for, post requests. That's probably silly because somebody else has already done that. You're better off, contributing to that person's project. Send them a pull request, and even if you get ignored, keep trying. I like your story, Tracy, had about somebody, getting rejected from 3. I did that once when it was a while back, and this project is actually huge and flourishing. But I sent these guys a couple of bug fixes, and like they didn't even respond, right? And later, it kind of turns out I just realized it's just a handful of guys that run this project, and they don't really want anybody else's help, right? They've got their own open source, they've got their kingdom, and they're lords of their kingdom, right? And that's fine. It's their project. Their stuff's out there for you to use, but if you don't find success the first time, keep going, right? And there's tons of stuff, especially in the development world, right? Because my background is development. There's all kinds of whether it's a WireMock or another testing tool or just any sort of little utility. There's tons of open source projects out there that you can engage with. And if you don't get a good response the first time, just keep plugging away.
Yeah, I love that. It's just like keep fighting for the things that you want, right? The outcomes and the goals that you're trying to achieve. And I think that's really important if you're looking to kind of build up like this reputation as a open source contributor and someone who accomplishes great things in the community. Tracy, did you want to add anything about any spaces that exist for contributors today?
Well, I'll shamelessly promote Ortelius. Abraham Ortelius was the first map maker. He was known to create the first atlas of the world. So we thought it was a fitting name for a project that its goal is to map a cluster. And so Ortelius it's really a microservice configuration management solution that puts the logical view of an application back into a microservice Kubernetes experience, so that you can version the application along with all the components that make up that application and track it over time. So Ortelius.io, and I'll put it in the chat. The other thing about getting involved in an open source community is a good open source community will build out issues. Start with some of the predefined issues that they're asking for help on. Especially if you've not worked in open source before, take some of the simpler issues and start getting yourself into those discussions. And then get brave to start making recommendations and start building out bigger parts of it. Because I think that, as Jeremy pointed out, there may be a core group of folks who really are still holding tight to their code, even though it's open source. And if you address the issues that are existing, it's an easier way for you to slowly sort of integrate yourself into the process. I know that for the people who are contributing to Ortelius now, that's how they've done it successfully. Not only do they get their head into it, but we understand who they are and what they want to do, and where they're coming from and how they want to solve problems. So look at the existing issues and start contributing there first.
Yeah, I love that. It's just like it's a really great way to kind of make slow wins, gradual wins, right? To
Yes.
snowball into something bigger, and also like get invited into the conversation, like having a seat at the table, right? Just because you come in, sometimes people don't understand like your intent, or what they don't understand your background, or what your experience is, and so being able to contribute small wins gradually over time is like a good way to contribute to the larger picture.
Yeah, we're still a community, and we have to, building trust and understanding your relationship and what your intent is a part of the puzzle that we're solving, and in terms of building a community and being able to see people who are willing to do what is needed before they try to jump into something bigger is great.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really good point. To keep things small and atomic, grab the issues, keep things small and atomic, like especially, and think about what you would like to have, how you would like somebody to contribute to your own project, right? Fixing a bug request is great, especially if it comes with a really nice test case, right? And then somebody can see it, work, and they know that, okay, I feel safe, adding this code in. If you have no background with somebody or no history with somebody, and you send them this, big, massive pull request for a feature that they may or may not even want in the product, they're probably not going to accept that. So yeah, start small, look at the issues, especially, everything's on GitHub, right, today. So just look at the issues on GitHub. Most teams are very happy to have somebody fix a bug for them.
I love that. That's all great advice. So today's conversation has been really interesting, and we're running out of time, but I'd still love to go around the room for one final question. And it's if you could go back in time to the start of when you first started contributing and being a part of this open source world, what would you tell yourself if you could only tell yourself one thing? I'd love to start with you, Jeremy.
Don't be shy about getting involved in communities. Don't assume. I guess I always assume like, oh, the guys that work on these projects must be better coders than me, right? And and maybe they are, to be fair, but it doesn't mean you can't contribute or you don't have something to add. Right?
I love that. That's so amazing. Tracy?
I first introduction to open source was sitting on that Eclipse board, and I think I would have I would tell myself, my past self, that it was hard being a woman sitting on that board, to be honest. And I would tell my past self that you deserve a seat at that table and to find your voice, because sometimes it would take me a while before I spoke up, and they got to know that when Tracy said something, she really meant it. But I think that as a woman, I would like to tell my past self that it was okay to speak up and to find your voice sooner. And I think that works for all open source, right?
Mhm.
It really does. We just had a meeting before this call, and one of the women, she said she finally spoke up, and she said, I'm trying to get into this slow because I'm not sure I would. I don't want to break anything. And that's another thing I would tell my past self. It's okay to break things in open source. Break it. You will learn from it.
I love that. JJ?
I'm going to go back to find the location where people talk. It took me a very long time to learn how to communicate in the way that an already established open source community speaks, however it is. That was a big stumbling block for me. Also learning how to thread email properly, like how to do non-top posting emails where you actually thread the conversation, because people might just jump in halfway through a whole long conversation and they need context, and they're not going to there can be complete waste of time on certain things, and there could be complete success. Learn how to interface with those the communities in the way they need to be.
Communication, right? Communication is key.
So, sorry, Tracy. What? No.
Just communicate.
That's a joke. That
was a good one. Okay.
Oh, I love that. Well, it's been an amazing panel discussion. We got to talk about the existing projects in this space, the projects that have made an impact, why community matters, the responsibilities, and all the tips and tricks that everybody has shared. Really love this panel discussion. We're out of time, but I want to thank all the panelist guests today here, and for all the attendees listening at Unscripted here. We're really glad to have hosted this open source panel, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of the event. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.